Okay, so picking up from where we left off at in our last PowerPoint. So just to echo that there is no one way for poetry to look, right? However, in every poem, no matter what it looks like, what it's about, who it's written by, it always goes back to these four elements. Okay, so every poem identifies as the patterned arrangement of language to generate rhythm and thereby both express and evoke emotions or feelings in a concentrated way or with intensity. So we're gonna, again, I have everything bolded, right? We're gonna focus in on there's always gonna be a patterned arrangement with some type of rhythm evoking emotions in a concentrated or intense way. So just keep that in mind, as we talk about now the different subgenres of poetry. So like I said before, not every poem, every poem is different, right? But traditionally, they usually fit into one of our four subgenres. So we've got narrative, dramatic, lyric, and dramatic monologue. So just taking us through them one by one. And again, the ebook offers a little bit more explanation along with other examples. So number one, narrative poetry. As it's titled, it is the most similar to fiction. So this is the poetry that tells us a story. And therefore, you might analyze it similarly to, looking at our short stories in the fiction unit. So you want to circle in on, what's the plot? What characters are described? Who's narrating it? Is there a setting? Is there symbolism? Is there theme? So I'm not sure if any of us have ever had to read an epic like Homer's Iliad or a ballad like Beowulf. Um, Most likely, if you read Beowulf, you remember it. I had to read it twice in high school, and no, thank you, never again. But it's going to be the dominant subgenre because, again, a lot of storytelling back in the day, it was in poetry form, right? So the example from the text that I just wanted to sort of offer as the go-to example for a narrative poem is Robert Frost's Out to Out. Okay. So the next genre of poetry is dramatic poetry, sorry. So again, it's in the title. It's the most similar to drama. So it's going to consist mostly of dialogue, or maybe it's a monologue in itself. You're going to see quotation marks. You might even see, like a he said, she said situation throughout, and with very little word from the narrator. So it's pretty much just a story being told in dialogue format, like, again, plays are. So again, back in the day, plays were written in verse. So, Shakespeare, can't think of any other examples right now. So this is very much where the modern dramatic poetry comes from. And so the example from the book of a dramatic poem is Thomas Hardy's The Ruined Maid, not to be confused with modern actor Tom Hardy. Very different people from decades apart. Our next genre of poetry is lyric poetry. So, this is going to be that stereotypical, maybe if you've seen a poem on social media lately, or again, not to assume, but maybe a lot of the poetry that you might have read or potentially even written in the past probably comes or is based on lyric poetry. So this is where it's going to be, I like to call it the floofy poetry, but I say that with all the love in the world. It's going to be very lyrical, right? Again, it's in the title of the poem. So lyric, it has that repetition, it has that rhythm, right? And so now it was originally thought to be associated with like religious, feelings. Now it's more so shorter poetry, again, expression of intense feeling. So, how does the lyric poem differ from narrative or dramatic? So, there is some type of plot, but it's very much focused on a single situation or an incident. So, you're not getting an entire story being described, you're getting like one moment. And you're probably coming into that moment in the very middle of things or in media res. And so it's up to you as the reader or the audience to kind of understand, how did we get here? Where are we going from here? All that stuff. And there's more of a description focused on the I. So it's very internal narrator. It most likely will be written in first person, but as I will talk about in a little bit, you never want to assume that even if a poem is written in first person, it comes from the poet themselves. Unless obviously you happen to know that it is, an autobiographical poem. So this is pretty much, again, lyric poetry, floofy writing, if you will, very lyrical and ethereal. And so the example from our textbook for lyric poetry is going to be William Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which you probably have read before. And then the final subgenre of poetry is dramatic monologue. So this is a mix between the lyric and the dramatic poetry. It's lyric because it features one single speaker who traditionally speaks in the first person, or it's assumed that it's, again, coming from the speaker's perspective. And it's dramatic because of these two reasons. So, number one, there's a primary focus on characterization. So it's a little difficult to explain, but basically, you get the sense that the speaker is kind of talking to somebody. So, kind of going to number two, addressing a silent auditor. So, someone that we can't see or hear. Again, very much like drama, right? They're talking technically to an audience that does not reciprocate the conversation. But they're talking to somebody about um, a more like a bigger conversation. So a lot of modern songwriters and modern poets tend to write in the dramatic monologue or for a dramatic monologue type of poem because, like I believe I mentioned before, song lyrics and, modern poetry, um, a lot of these artists are using their platforms to talk about bigger issues, that have been happening, that had happened. And so a dramatic monologue is basically the poet entering into a bigger conversation. So my example is Bob Dylan's The Times They Are a Changin'. I'm not sure if we're familiar, but Bob Dylan kind of infamously back in the day. So this song came out around 1963, 64, I want to say. And obviously, we had already talked about this, I believe, in terms of the play. That time in our country, civil rights movement, Jim Crow, we had a very, a lot of conversations were happening. And so Bob Dylan was one of the first white singers that wanted to talk about these issues that were obviously being faced by a majority of people of color. So a lot of his fans that were and probably still are traditionally white, middle to maybe middle class, they weren't used to that. And so this song and a lot of the songs on the same album became these sort of associated with the civil rights movement. And so again, example of a dramatic monologue, because if you read the song lyrics, which, they're not obviously in our ebook, I have the website right here, but, Google is free as well. You get a sense that the speaker is talking to somebody. You don't know exactly who, but they are talking about the sort of, again, in that time period, modern conversations about the bigger things that were happening. And so we will talk a lot more about that when it comes to our class discussion. But I just wanted you to get a sense of, again, these are the 4 different subgenres, and traditionally, all poetry falls under one of these subgenres. Okay, so our final slides are getting into the elements of poetry. So I'm going to go over them fairly briefly. I only have about 4 to 5 minutes left in this recording. But again, I have the chapters from our ebook. But for the most part, again, we've been talking about different literature analysis elements from the very beginning of our semester through short fiction, through the play. It doesn't necessarily change a whole lot in this final genre of poetry. So getting into speaker. And you'll notice that I have questions at the end of every element. So for speaker, we want to think about whose voice are we hearing? Who's the person that is in a narrative poem telling us the story, in a dramatic monologue, talking to that silent auditor, in a lyric poem, who is the person that is kind of taking us on this journey with them? And like I said before, we never want to assume that the speaker of a poem is the poet, even if it's written in first person perspective. Traditionally, yes, they tend to be from the poet's perspective, but we never want to assume that. The next thing is situation and setting. So situation, basically plot. What is happening in the poem? So, sometimes we know a lot of it. If it's a narrative poem, we're able to kind of break down the plot similarly to how we did it in the fiction unit, right? If it's, maybe something more lyrical or a dramatic monologue, it can be difficult to suss out, or kind of track what is exactly happening. But there are some questions there to kind of prompt, to kind of, get you thinking about what might I be understanding is happening in this poem. And then setting, again, that literally never changes. Where are we? When are we? But, we never want to assume that even if a poem was written in 2025, maybe it takes place in 1985, right? It's all about contextual clues, there are poems, I'm forgetting the terminology right now, where they do at the very beginning tell you if it's based on like a singular event. So, for example, the inauguration of President Joe Biden. If Amanda Gorman was writing a poem that she wanted to talk specifically about that day, at the top, she might have put, his inauguration day, right? Then we know there's no guessing about it when and where we are. But traditionally, again, it's kind of going back to drama a little bit, filling in the gaps, reading between the lines, and also just sort of coming to the terms of sometimes we don't exactly know when and where we are, and that's okay. So then the next one is tone. Obviously, we had talked about this in terms of fiction and drama. How does the poem make us feel, right? Again, a lot of emotions around poetry, some of them more intense than others. And then theme, what is the deeper messaging? That literally never changes. And then finally, symbol. So, are there any images associated with the deeper meaning behind the poem? Again, traditionally, every poem or song lyrics will have at least one symbol, maybe one that kind of guides us through the events of what's happening, or the lyricism of it. If not multiple symbols. So that is definitely something, along with all of these other elements, that you want to keep in mind. How do I feel about the poem? Recognizing there's no right or wrong way to do that. Am I noticing any repetitive symbols? And what is the deeper message of this poem?